Good day, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar of ACC Europe in partnership with Square Pattern Box, Geopolitics and AI. Where are we heading? I'm Associate General Counsel and Corporate Secretary EMEA at Arhezanius Midland, Fortune Global 500 global leader in human and animal nutrition with supply chains spanning all the globe, leading a team of international legal counsels. And with that, I'm hand over to David for introductions.
Thanks very much, Małgorzata. I'm David Naylor, partner at Squire Patton Boggs. I head our data and digital practice and also lead the firm's global AI group.
I'm Matthew Kirk, International Affairs Advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, advising on geopolitical and technology risk.
Good evening, everyone from Sydney. My name is Tanvi Mehta-Krensel, and I'm a partner in the Data and Digital Group along with David. And I was formerly head of product privacy and AI at TikTok.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So perhaps just to set some context, I think it's worth briefly reflecting on the fact that we seem to live in times of great disruption. We have hybrid warfare taking place in Europe, the rise of populism, a trade war launched by the US of all jurisdictions, and a highly volatile US administration at the moment. And it seems like the world is becoming materially more unpredictable, and in the middle of all that, we have a technology revolution taking place. And I thought, Matthew, it would be extremely interesting to hear your views on the forces that are driving some of these changes.
Thank you very much, David. So I think, as you say, it's a time of shifting tectonic plates. It's a time of considerable uncertainty. And there are three huge areas of change happening simultaneously. This, for most of us, is a scale of change that we haven't seen in our working lifetime. And those three areas of change are the sort of the tectonic plates of geopolitics shifting, the world order as it's run for roughly sort of 30 years from the end of the Cold War through to COVID. Clearly now no longer functioning in the same way, and at the center of it, a contested, competitive, and sometimes conflictual relationship between the United States and China. And then the second huge area of change is the climate. Obviously, we are seeing more and more the impacts of climate change, and the way in which that is driving a number of other underlying pressures. And I'm going to talk about the sort of vectors which are driving change in a minute. And then the third, which is the sort of main area for this webinar, is technological change driven by AI, by robotics, by very advanced data analytics and quantum computing. So you've got those three vast areas of change all happening simultaneously. And I think that there are then four vectors which drive change into that, one of which is the direct impact of the geopolitics, which you see in warfare, in sanctions, in refugees, and so forth. And then the second, which is in some ways a consequence of that, is increasing populism in our societies, our politics. Democratic politics increasingly challenged in the way in which it operates in all of our societies, traditional political parties finding it hard to function. And then the third vector of change is technology, and we can talk more about the direct impact of technological change as it comes in. And the fourth, which is the sort of policy response to all of that, you find in regulation, in trade policy, tariffs, in sanctions, and so forth.
And Matthew, just in terms of the pace of change, you and I have a couple of slides that we occasionally share. Shall we move on to onto those?
Absolutely. Let's have the first of those, if we could. So this is the past is obviously not an indicator of the future. This is a slide which attempts to encapsulate 3,000 years of human history onto a single graphic. The lines you can see, if the script is a bit small on whatever device you're watching on, cover life expectancy, GDP per capita, the percentage of the population not living in extreme poverty, energy capture, energy consumption per person, the ability.
Matthew, you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. So what you can see on this slide is these 6 lines, important vectors in the way humanity developed, human history in a single chart, and huge events: the fall of the Roman Empire, the Andrishan Rebellion, Genghis Khan rampaging across Europe, the Black Death, the Renaissance. None of that really shifts the axes at all until you get to the Industrial Revolution. And then everything shoots off. Every aspect of human history that this chart looks at is transformed by the Industrial Revolution. If we could now move on to the second slide, we can have a look at what that means in terms of employment, the labor force, and the deployment of economic resource. This is looking at the US across a sort of 150-year period. And you can see there that you go from a society in which, in some cases, every country, I should say, going through the Industrial Revolution looks similar to this. In some cases, the agricultural bar, which here starts at around 50%, starts much higher, 70, 80%. The manufacturing one, the industry one, is always around the sort of 20 to 30% mark. And then services is very low. In the US, they started slightly higher for this phase. And what you see over the period of the Industrial Revolution is this huge transfer of the application of labor, essentially out of agriculture and into services, with industry and manufacturing remaining broadly stable through the period, but obviously productivity in industry going up enormously through the period, and that creates an incredible effect in the economy in terms of the increase in wealth, but fundamentally a massive transfer out of agriculture and into services. And I think what's important to note on this slide is that it happens over a 150-year period, which means that typically the agricultural laborer at the left-hand end of the chart did not need to retrain as a hairdresser or whatever in order to survive in the new economy. They could carry on as an agricultural laborer, and it was their children who moved into new jobs, and broadly the transfer happened from one generation to another. Now, is technological transformation going to happen at that same relatively slow pace, or are we in a world of change accelerating faster to that? And I think, David, you've got a slide which we've used, which is quite a good one to look at speed of introduction of technology.
Thank you so much, Matthew. So what this slide indicates is the average pace at which a number of consumer-facing technologies reached 1 million users. And so you can see it on the left-hand side that it took Netflix about 3.5 years to get to 1 million users. Spotify, I think, was just over a year, adding around 6,000, 7,000 users a day. I mean, obviously, these are just averages. The iPhone faster still at 13,500. And then ChatGPT got to 1 million users within 5 days. So that's an average of 200,000 users added a day. And I think if you reflect on these three slides, we first of all looked at a period of about 3,000 years, and we zoomed into the last 150 and the Industrial Revolution. I think what this slide shows us is the astonishing pace of change in terms of technology. And I think that is perhaps most significantly reflected when we consider the pace of adoption of AI. If we think back 3, 4, 5 years, I would imagine that the majority of the companies represented by those attending this webinar were not using AI across their customer or employee facing capabilities. And I would guess that right now, probably 50% or more already are. And this is driving fundamental change across the corporation. And of course, part of the purpose of this webinar is to look at how geopolitics, technology, AI is likely to affect corporations internationally, and therefore perhaps share some insights that may be relevant to the General Counsel on this session. So, Matthew, in terms of the AI revolution, I think it's relatively clear that we're seeing two probably superpowers emerging, the US and China. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on whether you believe it's game over for any other nation states, and what the impact of the dominance of those two major powers is likely to be on trade and technological development globally.
So yeah, I think we're seeing two very different models emerge in the US and China, and the overwhelming majority of AI development and new capability is being created in those two markets. The US is one, as is traditional in the US economy, essentially of allowing an extraordinary range of innovation to happen, driven by the private sector, driven by private investment, creating incredible values, and I think they are incredible. I think there's increasing talk about an AI investment bubble, but also astonishing innovation, and as you showed, speed of adoption, but also speed of innovation is remarkable in the AI world. And those incredible values leading to massive investments in the hardware, the chips, the data centers, and so forth, which underpin AI. China is a much more politically directed innovation environment. It's one in which the party essentially determines the scale of innovation, the pace of innovation, and the purpose of innovation. And therefore has much more control over the way in which AI is introduced and its social impact. And I say that, both in terms of using AI increasingly as part of the way in which the party governs China, but also in terms of managing the effects of AI coming into the Chinese economy and industry and professional services and so forth. So I mean, I wouldn't like to say that one is going to be more successful than the other. I was really making the point that they're very different. I think you'll continue to see the most remarkable innovation being driven in the US, but maybe an innovation system overall and the way in which it works in society being more designed for the long term in China. Is it over for the rest of us? I think we have considerable opportunities in the UK and in the EU in terms of the use of AI. I think in terms of the core sort of underlying development of capability, both in innovation and in deployment of capital, it would be very, very hard for us to catch up. I would say I think that the way in which the EU in particular has set about regulating AI creates a lot of challenges for innovators, and it's striking, excuse me, that there is a debate happening in Brussels about how to bring the AI Act into effect in such a way that it doesn't dampen innovation in the way that it currently looks set up to do. So I would say at the application and extraction of value within industry, value within services layer, we can absolutely keep pace in terms of the sort of core vertical column of AI. That race has probably got quite a long way before we've really got to the starting blocks.
Let's talk very briefly about the pace of disruption that AI seems likely to bring about. A well-known IT company, global business, recently announced that of its 9,000 back office staff, it was terminating 4,000 of them because the deployment of AI enabled it to do the same job with far fewer people. And one of the things that I think is perhaps potentially concerning, notwithstanding the many opportunities that AI delivers for corporations and individuals who are able to use it effectively, is that when you look at the change that was brought about during the Industrial Revolution, even over a period of 150 years, and your comments about individuals potentially being able to retrain during the course of their lifetime, it was still the case that many who had lived and participated in the agrarian economy were not well suited or necessarily able to move to the cities and gain useful employment in factories and in industry. And many were left behind, notwithstanding the fact that the Industrial Revolution obviously created many jobs that hadn't previously existed. With the speed at which AI is being adopted, it seems, and the nature of its capabilities, it seems to me that there is going to be a real challenge for corporations with regard to their ability to retain and or retrain employees, and the ability of individuals to reshape their careers if they are being displaced by AI. And Matthew, your views on that and how corporates might deal with that challenge would be very interesting.
So I think this is one of the most difficult areas. And as you say, we are starting to see effects in the jobs market, which may or may not be a direct consequence of deployment of AI, but are potentially so. Graduate recruitment numbers well down in some professional services sectors and so forth. The thing that most depresses me, and I should say I'm fundamentally an optimist about what AI can deliver for the economy, for society. The thing that most depresses me is that I don't see any sign of governments really thinking about how to ensure that the current labor force is both through the sort of lifetime education retraining skills system being equipped to deal with a speed of transformation that may well be accelerating, and to have the confidence and the competence to move into new areas as AI creates dislocation and displacement. Nor do I see within the sort of primary education system that the next generation of the workforce is being developed in such a way that they will have that natural adaptability and flexibility. So who is going to have to do this? Well, I think there are two comments I'd make. The first is that I think, at least initially, we're going to see more the effect of what I would call the AI enhanced human. In other words, the individual member of the workforce becoming enormously more productive through support tools which are AI driven, and in industries, robotics, which are AI driven. But as dislocation happens, I think that there is an interesting debate to be had about the social contract and the way in which companies will have a responsibility, if you like, a social responsibility, and possibly ultimately a legal or regulatory responsibility to ensure that that the benefits that they secure out of deployment of AI in terms of greater productivity and so forth are shared in some way with those who are dislocated by it. Now, whether that's training programs or funding of some central training program or what it is, I don't know. But I think that there is a debate which will develop quite rapidly in that area. And it's striking that we are already seeing organized labor, whether it's trade unions or where you have sort of statutory organized labor through works councils and so forth, starting to say that the deployment of AI into businesses is not purely a question for the management and owners of the business. It is also a question for the workforce. So I think a big question mark there, and one that it needs to be addressed relatively quickly.
I have one more question for you, Matthew, which I think would be helpful to discuss, and then if it's all right, it'd be great to bring Tanvi and Malgorzata into the conversation. So one of the areas of work that we're particularly busy in for many clients is assisting with the development of AI governance frameworks and helping corporates develop the ability to assess the potential deployment of AI systems, consider the regulatory, legal, IP, and other issues, and then to deploy effectively. And those governance frameworks are very largely driven, not entirely so, but very largely driven by the regulation that is coming out of, in particular, Europe, and of course, primarily the EU AI Act, although of course GDPR has provisions in it around automated decision making as well. Do you think that in terms of the direction of travel amongst the European legislative bodies, do you think they will row back on some of the EU AI Act provisions? It's sort of kind of difficult now that it's law and set to come into force, but there's certainly talk about that. And then it'd be really interesting to hear from Tanvi about some of the geopolitical and technological changes she's seeing from the APAC perspective, and also as previously an in-house counsel, and what the regulatory direction of travel is in her region.
So very, very quickly, and then I'll hand on to Tanvi, because we've been talking a lot about the Northern Hemisphere, and it'd be great to hear a bit what's going on in the APAC region. I think there's a real tension within the EU between the desire for innovation, the desire for growth. All EU economies, or all major EU economies, are challenged from a growth point of view, and better application of technology is clearly something that can increase productivity and growth. That on the sort of plus side, which pushes towards an alleviation of the burdens on business of the AI Act. On the other side of the balance is partly the way in which the EU and the European Parliament in particular has in recent years conceived that the precautionary principle should be applied. And I think the debate there is about whether you regulate to prevent risk from happening before it happens, or whether you regulate to correct harm when harm happens, a sort of Anglo-Saxon versus a Colbertian view. I think also there is still a sense, and I remember hearing a senior EU official a few years ago, off the back of the sort of success of GDPR, as it was then seen, in establishing global privacy standards, that the EU was talking about China as an economic superpower, America as a military superpower, and the EU as a regulatory superpower. And I think there is still a sense that by setting a standard for the deployment of AI into a society and an economy, that could become a global standard. I think it's increasingly clear that the AI Act will not achieve that. And therefore there is a question mark over the extent to which it is still in Brussels' interests to be pursuing the sort of regulatory superpower idea. But with that, let me hand on to Tanvi. Please tell us how all this looks from the other side of the world.
From upside down. Yeah, exactly, Matthew. And thank you to you and David for that very insightful discussion. I particularly agreed with your comments around the bifurcation of the world into the two. Oh, sorry, my lights have gone off. I think you can still see me. It is 8:30 here in Australia. The bifurcation of the world into two different paths or two different superpowers from the perspective of AI. I think from an APAC perspective specifically, of course, leaving aside China, I would say that most countries in my region are still figuring out the role that they want to play in the AI revolution. And that applies both with regard to infrastructure and thinking about the kind of regulation which should or could be passed to specifically deal with AI. So Australia, which is the country where I'm from, is a tier 1 country under the US's Diffusion Act, or at least President Biden's Diffusion Act, which means, I understand, that it would have relatively greater access to both AI compute and model weights that come from the US. And this is the position for other countries in the region, like our Northern Asian neighbors in Korea and Japan. As well as that, though, Australia has very significant data center capability and its own renewable energy sources, which you would think would make it quite keen to participate in the AI race. And interestingly, that actually has not been the case so far. Australia, or at least our government, has not inked any deal with chip providers, despite the fact that it has been courted by NVIDIA and OpenAI, as recently as when the government was in New York for the UN General Assembly. But they haven't shown, I suppose, any commitment to the technology or any real commitment to developing the infrastructure here in Australia. And from a regulatory perspective too, we quite famously really have nothing like the EU AI Act in any APAC country that I know of, except Korea, which will have AI regulation from the start of next year. Interestingly, I've actually noticed in APAC that there's almost been a shift towards adapting existing laws to facilitate innovation. So again, recently in Australia, a prominent government body has put forward the case for creating an exemption to copyright infringement for text and data mining, on the basis that this will actually encourage local AI providers to build up their capabilities in a way that we know global AI providers, particularly from the two central blocks, have already done. In Japan, similar steps have been taken. The government issued guidelines last year that the use of copyright material for information analysis, which includes AI training or training of AI models, is permitted without a copyright owner's consent, again, with the view of facilitating AI development in that country. And finally, and I found this one the most surprising as a privacy lawyer at heart, the Korean privacy regulator, again, famously strict, has issued guidance that the use of publicly available personal information to train AI models can be justified on the grounds of legitimate interests, which at least historically has always been a grounds of processing that has been very narrowly interpreted by the regulator. So if I can continue to use military methodology, it's not quite a call to arms, not yet. But I think it's really interesting that all of the countries that I've mentioned are typically quite conservative, at least from a legal perspective, but they're all at least floating the possibility of existing laws being expanded to better allow for the use of data and the use of infrastructure to develop and further AI in their countries. And I also don't think it's an accident that Korea and Japan in particular are geographically very proximate to China. So of course they want to use the natural resources that they have and the expertise that they have in areas like robotics for Japan and consumer goods for Korea to build up their arsenal. And I do think, Matthew, your comment on the EU AI Act is, and particularly how it compares to GDPR, is reverberating here in APAC. When GDPR came into effect, slowly but surely, we saw local versions of the GDPR start to establish themselves in countries like Thailand, in countries like Indonesia, and even a little bit in Australia. I don't think that we'll see that same approach with the EU AI Act. I think that there's generally support for a more flexible approach than simply blindly following the position that's been taken in Europe. And I've actually heard, interestingly, from an Australian online safety perspective, that there's no interest in legislating high-risk uses of AI here, not for the reasons that I mentioned, for a completely different reason, which is that what is high risk in an AI context tends to develop and adapt all the time. So keeping our terminology and our laws broad is actually more helpful to APAC than narrowing them down. So that's a bit of a glimpse of what I'm seeing in APAC. And as you can see, there's a lot in the AI ecosystem which is affected by culture, affected by language, affected by history, including, I would think, supply chains. And Malgorzata, I'd be really interested in hearing your views on how supply chains have evolved in this AI revolution.
Yes, thank you. And as you said, cultural elements play a great role here too. AI supply chains are less tangible than the supply chains we know from several hundreds years ago, putting containers and commodities from one place to another. Now the supply chains are made of data, algorithm, computer power, and also of people. And each of them is tied to a certain jurisdiction, to a regulation. They have political interest. And supply chains now mirror the hidden architecture of globalization, and also mirror how technology and politics reshape the world. So we can say that every line of code, every training data assets, every cloud provider now embeds a chain of geopolitical dependencies and those in-house counsels. We see it daily. For example, a vendor that once seemed low risk suddenly falls under export controls. A cloud provider changes its data storage policy after some regional dispute, or AI partner model turned to be trained on the data that actually cannot legally cross the borders. And these scenarios are not hypotheticals anymore. We see it every day. It's a new reality, and it's a real risk in motion. What we are also seeing is the rise of data sovereignty as the new trade frontier. Jurisdictions now treat data as a strategic asset, something to be controlled, localized, or I would even say weaponized. So for global companies, this means designing systems that can live and be functional inside multiple legal climates at the same time. And the world is getting smaller and fragmented at the same time. Matthew mentioned digital rising power blocks, US with innovation and market speed, EU shaping north through regulation, accountability, China pursuing their technological self-sufficiency under a state strategy. And each of these building blocks has its kind of own internal market, internal roles. its own version of what responsible AI is. So we as corporate counsel are constantly trying to bridge the blocks to make one company's framework work across different competing regulatory philosophies and everything at the same time. So from the legal operations point of view, this creates new categories of risks. You can think about contractual defaults that don't come from non-performance as we know it from several years or several years ago, but from geopolitics, export bans, sanctions, localization mandates, due diligence that now goes far beyond financial stability. We need AI provenance, where the data comes from, who trained the model, what jurisdiction touched the workflow, and perhaps more importantly, trust. Because in AI supply chain, how I see it, trust is a compliance asset. Without transparency into AI stack, from training data to downstream outputs, you actually cannot demonstrate compliance. You can sustain partnership and you can protect your reputation effectively. Tanvi, what would be your take on this new complexity?
So much of what you said rings true, particularly as someone who used to manage product and AI for TikTok across the APAC and emerging markets region. It was hard enough developing a coherent strategy across those countries. I can't even imagine that the task that many people on this call have to deal with, which is developing that same strategy globally. I would say that the balance that you've mentioned that needs to be struck between local law compliance and some sort of coherent, consistent, uniform policy and practice within the company is a hard one. And I don't profess to know all of the answers. But as someone located in APAC, of course, I would say this, but I will say that I think there is some benefit to having a company-wide approach to something like Gen AI, for example, or the use of AI in higher risk areas like HR, which we've discussed, and employment. And I think that really for two reasons. The first is that even though we do have a significant degree of regulatory fragmentation, I am seeing the same principles assert themselves again and again when it comes to AI. And they tend to center on transparency, fairness, privacy, bias, I guess, is the flip side to fairness, and other things like that, even if those words are not expressly used in either the AI specific or existing laws that are used to regulate AI. So I do think that if a global company is able to take those principles into account as sort of a minimum viable product, it's likely to address some of the higher risk scenarios. So for example, as David mentioned, or I think Matthew talked about it as well, HR and employment is increasingly a battleground, even here in Australia, when it comes to the use of AI. So if those principles start to be adopted more generally, I think that we're coming at that problem proactively and in a way that doesn't fall foul of anti-discrimination law. And then I also think that, at least here in Australia, and I think also in many Asian countries, including Singapore, the government is very willing to listen to industry as they're trying to figure out their pathway through this. So for the kind of organizations on this call who are leaders in the space, if you're able to demonstrate what good looks like within your company, and equally, I suppose, what good could look like more broadly, then I think that there's a real possibility that you'll be able to shape the discussion in your country. And I hope I don't sound naive in saying that, but I really do think it's a time of flux and government is consulting as much as they possibly can. I would also very briefly say, just on the question of AI suppliers, I'm seeing a little bit of the GDPR effect in that it does seem like suppliers are offering these very comprehensive AI protections, a bit like Article 28 of the GDPR data processing agreements to European customers. But as David was saying, we're not quite seeing that same level of commitment, at least for me, in APAC. Of course, my advice would be different depending on whether you are a customer or a supplier. And I noticed we've got a few of both on the call, but certainly for customers, I have been pushing to see the same sorts of protections in our agreements for the same reason as I mentioned before, that many of the principles around responsible AI, particularly in higher risk scenarios, are the same. And if a company is able to offer, a supplier is able to offer those protections in one jurisdiction, there may even be a benefit for that supplier in keeping that standard of service consistent across countries.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about responsibility, strategy, and direction, also integrity, I see that as corporate counsels, we are moving from gatekeepers to strategic translators, connecting geopolitics and technology and business priorities into something that can be coherent and actionable and flexible at the same time. So we now anticipate how regulations will shift and how that shift will then echo through contract, supply chain processes and board discussions through all the organization. And as nations compete for control, our responsibility is to build trusted, resilient, and legally defensive ecosystem to make global cooperation possible in the landscape increasingly defined by divergence.
Absolutely. I think, and I've been saying this to clients here who are reluctant to buy into AI protections or governance because we don't have that kind of law yet here in Australia, that contracts are themselves a source of law. They're themselves a source of responsibilities and obligations, and setting that standard at the contract level or at the governance level, as you mentioned, David, helps to promote your own agenda and ideas of what responsible AI should look like. And I do think it's a really sensible thing to do, notwithstanding where we are right now in most APAC countries. Just to pivot slightly, I think the other thing that I'm finding really interesting and that I dealt with quite a lot when I was in-house is what happens when things go wrong. So what happens, for example, when there's geopolitical backlash against a particular AI supplier or a country in which your data is hosted? How do you develop resilience? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Margazata, but maybe just before I ask you, I'll talk a little bit about DeepSeek, which seems like a uniquely Asian situation. So DeepSeek, obviously, for those who don't know, has its own, it's a Chinese headquartered company, and it has its own LLM, which for some time at the start of this year looked like it was competitive to OpenAI's ChatGPT, at least the model before last of ChatGPT. It was also quite a bit cheaper and less resource heavy than OpenAI was stating that ChatGPT was, and it offered the ability of open weighting. So it was relatively, or at least slightly easier for developers to see how the model had been trained and to build their own products on top of it. So it generated great excitement for a period of time, I think at about February of this year. And then the data protection regulators got wind of it. And we had, for example, the Italian and the Korean data protection regulators either recommending that it be banned or asking serious questions about the transparency measures that it took and where it was sending data and where it was storing European or Korean data, whether that was China, and if so, on what basis. We also saw the Australian government very quickly act to ban the use of DeepSeek on Australian government devices. So very quickly, it seemed just as quickly as DeepSeek had risen in popularity, it was at least falling, or it was finding a lot of pushback from regulators, which means pushback in the countries where it's trying to launch. And just on that kind of development, which I feel like we'll see again and again, given the comments that Matthew and David made at the top of this session. Again, I think there's probably two things to be aware of as in-house counsel and to prepare for. And the first is really to be as transparent and clear as possible about your use of these technologies. There will be a limit, obviously, practically, to how much you want to disclose, but if you can flag in your privacy policy that you are using these kinds of technologies or sending data to these countries, then you're at least avoiding the finding that you're being misleading and you're trying to hide something which may not actually be the truth. And also, I think internally document as much as possible about your use of these technologies. And perhaps you need a DPIA, perhaps you need a transparency registry, but you need to show that you've done no pun intended, deep thinking about the AI models and the AI, the countries in which your models are operating. And I think the other thing I would say, again, having been in-house counsel for TikTok, is that you need to be prepared to pivot. You need to diversify your suppliers, which I think, Malgorzata, you would agree with, given your comments about supply chain. Avoid your reliance as much as you can, given the situation we find ourselves in, on any single jurisdiction, and build redundancy into the suppliers that you do use. And also, if you are working with riskier suppliers or riskier countries, think about how you can minimize the data that you share with those suppliers or those models. One option might be to host your own data on premise and use those suppliers just for very limited processing, so that if someone does come knocking, you're able to say that you've put into place measures to protect your data and to stop your data being used in a way that would be in breach of data protection law. I think that flexibility, building in that flexibility into your supply chain, is maybe not new, but seems particularly pertinent when it comes to AI.
I can absolutely agree. There's this quote saying that the more you sweat in training, the less you blood during the war. So preparing policies, training your staff, training your teams is absolutely something that everyone needs to do. But I also think at least the same level of importance has defining on the purpose of the company, defining on how much risk appetite we have, what's our integrity level, what are our ethics values that we want to stick to in case of destruction, because you can prepare as much as you want, but you cannot predict everything. And very often the company shifts because someone doesn't understand the global purpose of in which direction we are heading. So we need to make sure that everyone who's taking a decision really understands the direction, the risk appetite, and has the same understanding of integrity and the compliance that company decides for themselves to stick to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious of time. I might just wrap up with a couple of thoughts from me in terms of practical tips for people on this call. I feel like I've already raised a couple of them, but maybe two that have gone unannounced. An idea that I like, which the Singapore PDPC has also experimented in, and I think the UK ICO, is the concept of setting up a sandbox within your company to test particular AI tools under defined parameters. And the reason I like that is because, again, coming from a region where we don't have anything like the EU AI Act, it's a great way of, I suppose, working out where your risks are and what particular uses of AI within your organization you may not have been aware of, and how they would play into the current regulatory framework in your country. I think there's some good tips, again, particularly from Singapore, as to how to run that kind of sandbox, but it could be helpful particularly if you're facing pushback about imposing that sort of global standard across your organization in terms of use of AI. And the other one, I think, Malgorzata, you alluded to it, but almost keeping a map of all the different jurisdictions in which your AI might be implicated. So that could be where the model was trained, or it could be the source of the training data. It could be where the data that you input into the model is hosted. I mean, all of these there could be 3 different countries implicated in each of the factors that I mentioned. And I think knowledge, as you said, I can't replicate your metaphor, it was too good, but knowledge is power. And having a sense of where your vulnerabilities are allows you to plan for any kind of pivot that you might need to do. Be interested in everyone else on the call's thoughts in terms of practical tips.
Yeah, I would say don't just build strong policies, but also strong and curious teams. Teams that ask this extra question, challenge all the assumptions you've been doing in the past, and see also the geopolitical dimension behind every decision that is going to be taken. And I'm convinced that trust becomes like a strategic asset, not only with regulators, but also with our partners and within organizations. So to all the fellow corporate counsels, let us lead with curiosity, protect with integrity, and empower through trust. Because leadership is measured less by what we control and more by what we enable.
So from my point of view, and thank you, Tanvi and Malgorzata, that's been a really fabulous discussion. And I'd particularly underline what you both have said about knowing what's going on in the organization. I'm struck at the number of organizations, companies, and other organizations where AI is coming in and there is no sort of central point of knowledge of what's being done, which doesn't necessarily mean a sort of intrusive control, though you may need that from a technology point of view. But certainly knowing what you're doing and in what jurisdictions you're doing it does seem to me to be, without that, you really can't run a governance process at all. And then harking back to something I was talking about, and I think Tanvi, Malgorzata, picking up on what you were just saying, I do think thinking about the effect of AI dislocation on your people and working with them to make sure that not only you get the most out of AI, but they are able to prosper through its introduction into your organization, into your company, even if that means doing something different. I think that's going to be a really important aspect of the social acceptability of AI in the economy. David, I think we're sort of handing back to you at the end.
Yes, I think you are. And just as a final thought, I think having an effective governance framework in place is key wherever the organization is based, wherever it's operating. Having one that's flexible enough to allow solid deployments of AI without creating unnecessary risk and remaining on the front foot with regard to employee relations, I think is absolutely key. One point which is perhaps slightly tangential, but nevertheless relevant, with the increasing competitive pressure that globalization has brought, the drive for companies to be as efficient as possible. Of course, there's been just a huge diversification in the use of suppliers and growth in company supply chains as services that the company is not itself best placed to self-provide are outsourced to providers. And what we are certainly seeing is increasing technological and cybersecurity risk in reliance on suppliers. There's definitely an uptick in vulnerabilities that come through the supply chain. So having robust procedures for engaging with suppliers and equally robust contracts, I think, is key. But let's wrap up with a thank you to Malgorzata, Matthew, and Tanvi for joining the call. And just two websites to draw to your attention. If you have a mobile phone, you can capture the QR code and go straight to them. The first is this firm's AI Law and Policy Hub, which has numerous articles, blog posts on AI-related developments around the world. Please do visit it. I think you'll find it helpful, and no doubt some of the articles will be relevant and of interest, and we'd also welcome any feedback on how we can continue to develop it to be as useful to you all as possible. And then the Association of Corporate Counsel Europe Hub has details on events that we are putting on in partnership with ACCE. We're delighted to be able to do so. I think there are some really interesting events coming up, so please do check that out, and hopefully we will see some of you at them. So thank you so much for joining. We have closed on time, and hope you have an excellent rest of the day. Thank you for all those who've joined from Asia, and a good evening and a good week. Thank you.